Thanks for being here. Thanks for inviting me. It's very nice to get to know really new people here. I only know Sharon so far. Okay, so what I will do here is interpreting the well-chosen title of the festival, Cherish and Destroy, from the point of view of philosophy. Because actually I admit that I don't have any specific competencies in architecture, and this is also why the illustrations that I have chosen, they are something that a lay person like me will find. Maybe if the illustrations are not the good ones, you will replace them in your mind. But I suppose I'm here because I have worked a lot on technology and also on art, and well, that is architecture, it seems to me, technology and art. In my work, I take technology in the most general sense of techne. It derives from the Greek term techne. It means art and skill and technique, and only later it has come to mean also technical objects and technological equipment, technological systems. So, therefore, techniques in this general philosophical sense does not only mean technological equipment, but also, more importantly, it designates subjective human skills of using your mind, your body, your instruments. It also means technological objects, anything you can produce technologically, things, works of art. Then it means human communities that are produced as a technological setting. And finally, of course, all of us live in a technological civilization. We are totally immersed in it. And the last sense of techniques I find important is that the technical culture in which we live actually produces us as technical creatures. We are totally determined by the civilization, technological civilization in which we live. In other words, techniques is something that mediates between us humans and our world and adapts them to one another. And for me, architecture concerns all of these mediations. And this is what I would like to think of. This is how I would like to think about architecture today. It is the technique of relating to the environment world. That means that architecture makes the mediations between the human and the world somehow conscious. It considers them as objects of aesthetic judgment, of course, but also in terms of moral and political judgments, deliberations. So if humans produce a world and the world produces us humans who inhabit in it, in architecture we try to decide how this reciprocal production should take place. I like to think about techniques in its relation to life. To explain this relation very concisely, I can refer to ancient Greek philosophy, to which we owe our most fundamental concepts anyway. So Aristotle, in his Physics, says, on the one hand, that techniques imitates physis. Physis, that's nature in the sense of a living or blooming or overwhelming kind of force. This is how the Greeks saw it. Now, if techne imitates physis, that can be translated as art imitates nature or techniques imitates life. Technique sometimes looks as if it was the opposite of nature, doesn't it? But in reality, it can only do the things that nature makes possible. For example, by developing possibilities in a natural material. Like you can build a house out of wood, but you cannot build a house out of water. On the other hand, Aristotle also says, well, that was a challenge now. Aristotle also says that techniques makes what nature cannot do. Techniques really add something to nature, something that would not grow on its own. Like, for instance, a house does not grow from the soil, forest soil on its own. You have to cut trees and assemble them somehow to make a house. So in other words, techniques is the opposite of nature, but also its continuation, its transformation and sublimation. Today, we have noticed something that the ancient Greeks did not pay so much attention to. Namely, the techniques is not only the continuation of nature, but it is also its transformation, contamination, pollution, and sometimes destruction. In its constructions, techniques both cherishes nature and destroys it, always irrevocably, inevitably. So in this fundamental relation between art and nature, or techniques and life, cherishing and destroying go always together. And this is what I want to speak about today. I like to think of nature in terms of life. Living always includes dying. I don't mean the obvious fact that at some point all living things end by dying, but the less obvious fact that some form of negativity, some form of death, perhaps a lesser form of death, constantly grafts itself onto life, like a dry fiber intertwined with fresh fiber in lions. While living consists in incorporating new elements, every inspiration, every piece of nourishment, every contact of things with the world, it also consists in giving up parts of itself, every expiration, every excretion, every act of rejecting something back to the world. Think of a forest. Something old has to wither for something new to grow. And what has withered is the very soil out of which this new thing will grow again. This is how life is constant transformation. That is to say, it's alive. And I think that this is also the case in architecture. Because at first sight, it might look like a purely technical act that produces constructions that are opposed to life or even sometimes hostile to life. The wood that you cut in order to build a house, it's taken out from the cycle of dying and living. It neither lives nor does it die, but it steps in this, it is somehow encapsulated in this kind of a long and relatively stable time of human history. It seems to overcome natural variation between living and dying and build a non-living and non-dying monuments that strive towards eternity. But you know very well that no human construction is ever eternal. Not only all of our constructions will crumble in the end, but during all their duration, they too wither in order to bloom. So architecture also lives out of this constant negativity of demolishing, dismantling, pulling down and destroying earlier constructions. And this is how architecture lives. It's how houses, blocks and cities breathe in and out. They incorporate new elements and reject obsolete ones. They associate with new blocks and dissociate from old blocks. And in this fundamental sense, a city, just like a forest, lives of its death, so that both the city and the forest realize Heraclitus' sentence, mortals, immortals, the one living the other's death and dying the other's life. Another way of saying this is that built places, and especially cities, are in a constant process of deconstruction. I'm quoting French philosopher Jean-Luc, who says, the city started as a construction site, and it can only live as a construction site. The city constructs itself by deconstructing itself. Deconstructing itself, it disassembles itself in order to assemble itself differently, in order to assemble itself, assemble an incessant alterity which can always be transformed, continued, renewed. The construction site reveals the metastable equilibrium of urbanity. But unlike a forest, though, the city does not simply wither and grow, living and dying, don't just happen to it. But it has its ways of withering and growing result from our decisions. And these decisions are, I think, the core of the art of architecture. Because architecture does not simply produce stable constructions. It chooses and programs and operates the ways in which human constructs relate to their environment, not only on the moment of construction and demolition, but all the time the building stands up. Doing so, it chooses and programs and operates the way in which we, humans, live, how we work and how we relax, how also we love and hate and know the world and rule the community. It also chooses and operates and programs the ways in which other natural humans, natural beings can live and die around us in the built and around the built environment. This relating to the environment is always a matter of cherishing and destroying, ultimately of living and dying. So it's quite a huge responsibility to decide about all this living and dying. Seen from this point of view, architecture is, as everybody here knows Martin Heidegger, he will say, a central way of being in the world. We humans live in the world by inhabiting it. And inhabiting is related to building and thinking about the world. Remember that all these three terms, inhabiting, building, and thinking, are verbs. They are not simply nouns. So we do something when we build, inhabit, and think. Our being in the world is not being placed in a place, let alone a building, but we relate to the world verbally, dynamically, by doing and acting. If you know Heidegger more than that, you know that his ideal of being in the world is letting be. So letting the world be, letting the world as it is. Philosophically, he thinks that the task of philosophy is to let being come forth as the question of its own being. Reflecting this, he seems to think that existentially, our task is to let the world come forth as the world that it is. But I'm afraid that this might be illusory and in any case insufficient to understand what is at stake in architecture only through the words of Heidegger. Because architecture never lets be simply. It cannot help laying hard foundations on soft land, cutting winding tree trunks into straight boards, impressing geometry on biology and mathematics on biology. Like in this Kifa painting I put here, it imposes human history on natural timelessness, whatever you do. This is why, as Peter Sloterdijk would say, architects are producing bubbles, which consist on material constructions, but also more generally of atmospheres. The architect's question would therefore not be how to let the environment be as it is, but how to involve in the environment in a cherishing manner, rather than in a destructive manner. And that is the question of technique itself, of the art and the manner of relating to the environment. Human life is never simply situated in a natural place. It always produces an artificial environment for its life. Art and techniques are the way in which human life relates to its environment. In architecture, this technique is at stake. It's a thrilling, if not outright terrifying realization, since I think I'd like to say all dimensions of these techniques of being in the world are at stake in architecture. Not only buildings, but life, politics, commerce, and nature around it. So, now I have been speaking of architecture in a general manner as an art and technique of relating to the environment. Today, we try to think here this technique in terms of cherishing and destroying. But what do these two terms then mean? What can they teach us? I want to make you think about them, think about three different ways of cherishing and destroying, and I hope that it can sort of open up the architect's task a little bit more. Here, the example is not very good, but I was a bit in a hurry. Because I wanted to speak first about a traditional and sometimes conservative way of understanding these terms, but this is not the conservative one. This is not, why it's not a good example. So there is a traditional way of thinking that architecture cherishes the natural or cultural environment when it protects it as much as it can. So that whatever new buildings are made, they are inserted gently to the existing situation without tearing down its organic tissue. So one cherishes old cities when houses are built in similar materials and similar dimensions. For instance, one can cherish an old village by constructing new houses with thatched roofs. So this one is in Leiden, not far from where I live. Well, it has the same dimensions as the surrounding houses, same colors, but well, it actually cherishes in a very imaginative and nice way, I think. On the contrary, you could say that architecture is destructive if it ruins the milieu. Like, admit it, grey towers of social housing at the outskirts of an old city. I didn't want to make a photo of that one. You know that this kind of buildings can be very destructive to all three ecologies named by Felix Guattari in his famous book, Three Ecologies, namely psychological ecology, sociological ecology, and ecological ecology as well. This kind of architecture destroys more than simply aesthetic values because it ruins souls, communities, and ecosystems. This being said, the opposite is not necessarily better, because the risk of an overprotective approach is, of course, that it paralyzes a milieu, changes it into a museum or monument of its own past. By refusing the death of the built milieu, it also refuses its life. So this overprotective approach also ignores the fact that there can also be apparently idyllic, beautiful environments which are not necessarily so utopic. For example, you can have lush countryside impregnated with toxic poisons, or you can have an affluent suburban neighborhood which is maintaining ruinous energetic solutions, promote unhealthy transportation systems, or in an egalitarian social structures. That is possible as well. I'm just giving you this quickly in passing. It's a Gedächtniskirche in Berlin, because another way of treating with this question of how to deal with how to protect might also be protecting a wound in a given environment. It's not always cleaning up things and making nice things. It can also be protecting a memory and celebrating a memory. But I leave this aside. Then there's another very, very different form of cherishing and destroying. When you interpret these terms in the context of this philosophical current of deconstruction. Okay. I'm not going to speak to you about the philosophical theory of Jacques Derrida, which comes into this, but the idea here is that you never really destroy, deconstruction both cherishes and destroys, because it does not simply destroy the architecture that was there, but it tries to revisit it all over again, not in order to reproduce it, but in order to invest the future from critical encounters with the past. So I'm just giving you 2 or 3 very quick examples of this, because actually I want to speak about something else than deconstruction to end here. So you know that there has been this so-called deconstructive kind of architecture, which surely looks at its environment, but understands this environment mainly as built environment, of which the deconstructive architecture asks what it is like. What are the fundamental commitments of the city planning and housing such as we have inherited it? And can they be contested? So this one is Jean Nouvel, this one is Frank Gehry, this kind of very, very spectacular buildings which open questions like, do we really, these works are characterized by non-linear design, non-Euclidean geometry, leaning walls, inclined floors, and that kind of things, producing something like an earthquake of classical geometrical principles. But then, here. I would like to go jump over this story of deconstructive architecture to come to a third form of architecture. Because in order to introduce a third and last sense of cherishing and destroying, distraction doesn't always care or qualify architecture in relation to environment, but the environment itself. And that is actually the most interesting for me today. Because of course it's important to think about a building's relation to the environment that ill-thought buildings exhaust and even destroy. But I would also like to think about buildings that destroy their milieu in the sense of destabilizing harmonious, I'm thinking about buildings that exhaust the milieu by polluting the water they sit on, overconsume the energy resources, poison the plants and animals, and so on. Recently, we have become very conscious about ecological, I'm not sort of lost here, trying to make it very quickly to the end so I don't get lost with my papers. Yes, we have become very conscious about the invisible, often invisible ecological impact of our buildings, and we know that we should do something about this kind of destruction and cherishing. But I would like to go a little bit further and think about environment itself as a place of destruction that the architecture has not caused, but that it encounters already there in the world. To give quick examples, I could mention 3 cases in which environment itself is hurt or wounded, not only destroyed, but destructive. In these cases, the environment is not destructive because of some architecture, maybe architecture has had a role, but that is not the real cause of destruction. It's destroyed because of some more general technological factors that naturally reflect social and political situations. The question that opens up in these cases is, can architecture become a way of healing and caring for situations that are already in themselves destructive? Can it become a way of changing life, cherishing life instead of destroying it? And specifically, can architecture counter a destructive technological situation and change it into a situation that actually cherishes life? So my first example here is war, which obviously ruins the entire environment. So when you think about Eastern Ukraine or Gaza today, you can easily see that the worst is not the destruction of habitations, cities and milieus by powerful weapon systems. The worst is the destruction of the psychic and social and political environments for a very long time to come. Facing such wounds, should architecture just demolish the ruins and hide the wounds that have been inflicted? Can it somehow heal the desperate situations like this? The second similar example would be poverty, which is very often confined to ugly, dysfunctional and unhealthy habitats that has not been built for its own sake, but simply slotted between zones of extractive, industrial or commercial exploitation. Of course, such a milieu is deleterious to the social and psychic reality of its inhabitants, and it also deleterious to the natural site overcome by the milieu. Facing poverty, what should architecture do? Should it simply demolish slums? Or should it somehow find ways of cherishing poor housing? What a strange question. The third example would be ecological destruction, especially pollution and excessive consumption of resources. It's worth noting that these can accompany both ugly and beautiful, poor and wealthy habitats. For example, nothing prevents a spectacular deconstructive building from being destructive from an energetic point of view. In that case, what is destroyed does not need to be a human habitat, but a more general natural habitat context that can be destroyed by more general technological related phenomena like pollution and climate change. So let us think about this definition of architecture as the art and technique of relating to environment. So can architecture understand its role in such a way that facing such destruction, its task is to repair and mitigate the ills that it has not caused itself? Now the general question is no more what kind of structures does architecture construct? But almost on the contrary, what are the structures of the world that the architecture reveals and dismantles and reorganizes? Can architecture itself deconstruct the world? Let me limit myself to the example of ecological destruction. So everybody knows that we live in an epoch of global warming, which is as such invisible, but thanks to huge masses of scientific information, we know that it is progressing, and we know that it will lead to diverse consequences like droughts and floodings and heavy rains, and all of that, rising sea level. All of this, of course, impacts habitat as well. Architecture can and should take all of this in account and invent solutions to changing circumstances. So this example is Vincent Calvo. I'm not sure it's built already, but what is actually important here is not that it looks like a plant, but it's supposed to be zero waste, zero energy, zero poverty. That's very brave of him to say, but it's a masterpiece of engineering, actually, in order to make it sustainable in all manners. And to end now, I would like to call architecture that puts such questions at the heart of its operation the biotechnical architecture. By biotechnics here, I do not mean any new architectural current, because it takes an architect to invent an architectural current, and that is not my case. I use this term biotechnics as a philosophical concept here, the aim of which is to designate the core challenge that contemporary architecture should face, at least I think so. You see that bio means life, and techniques means all the technical ways of producing an artificial dimension of human life. You remember, Aristotle said that techniques imitates life, and that's what life cannot do alone. But today we are much more conscious of the difficulty or the gap between bios and technique, that the simple word imitates has to cross. For us, bios, life or nature, is not a simple positive starting point of building, a natural site where you build, for instance, but it has become to stand for a problem that techniques must strive to solve. Thinking of a flooding, for instance, cold, heat, pollution, and all that. And similarly for us, techniques is not a simple way of solving problems. It is an ambiguous power that both solves problems and causes them. For it can also hurt and destroy the life that it draws from. And its challenge is to learn to cherish it instead. So the gap between life and techniques has therefore become much deeper and much more problematic than ever. It can lie between natural destruction and technological destruction, which we should learn to turn into truth. And this passage is the very place of architectural thinking today, this biotechnical architectural thinking, which does not only look for aesthetic and technical solutions to aesthetic and technical problems. It is mindful of all psychological, ethical, political, and ecological consequences implied by any architecture disease. That is what I would call biotechnical architectural thinking today, striving to be conscious of all these dimensions at the same time and carrying responsibility of this huge gap between bias and techniques today. So here's what I did for you today. Thank you. Sorry about the long.